Hi, I'm Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and the G7 and G20 in A Level Politics. I'm going to start by looking at the parts of the specification. This video covers some key 12 markers and 30 markers you get asked on this topic in the exam. Before starting by looking at the World Trade Organization, looking at its origins and aims, what it does, and the debate about its strengths and weaknesses, before doing the exact same for the G7 and the G20. The notes you can see on screen are part of an updating textbook on global politics for the Edexcel A Level Politics specification that you can purchase on the Politics Explained website. You can also find loads of other resources to help you in your Politics A Level, including essay plans covering every single part of the course, and these updating textbooks that do exactly the same. They're really detailed and constantly updated so that they're always relevant, as the essay plans are too. On the Politics Explained website, you can also find a place to sign up for tutoring if that's something you'd be interested in, and a place to sign up for the waitlist for some live revision webinars we're going to be doing before the 2025 exams. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So starting off with the parts of the specification this video covers. So this is on subtopic 2, global governance, political and economic, and it's the fourth of 5 videos. We've already looked at the United Nations and NATO for the political global governance. We've already looked at the IMF and the World Bank for economic global governance, and now for this we're going to look at the final 2 key institutions, which are three actually: the World Trade Organization, the G7 and the G20, looking at their role and significance and their strengths and weaknesses. As with all of the 12 markers we've been speaking about, the ones in bold have essay plans on the Politics Explained website, and the 30 markers that are really detailed if you want to go and purchase them. And if you know the ones in bold, even if you just go and do it yourself and know the content well, you can adapt that to most questions that could come up in the exam. So you should be really well prepared for the exam. Of course, it's not just about reading through them. You really need to practice with them and practice answering different questions as well. But all of these 12 marks are comparative. So they're asking you to compare 2 institutions, 2 concepts, something like that. So that's where these institutions are going to come in. So you might get asked to compare, as with this question here, the World Trade Organization with the International Monetary Fund, or potentially it could be with the World Bank. Or you might be asked to compare it with the G7/G20, or compare just the G7 and the G20, potentially looking at the differences, looking at the similarities. So they're the kind of questions you could get for the 12 markers. And then in terms of the potential essay questions, you can very much bring this stuff into questions on economic global governance and whether it's effective, also whether economic global governance is effective in tackling poverty, for example, as well as a lot of these other questions as well that aren't in bold. Yeah, let's start off by having a look at the World Trade Organization. So it was established in 1995 as a successor to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was created as kind of as part of the Bretton Woods institutions to promote international trade by reducing trade barriers. So it's very much a key successor to that organization. Today, the WTO has 164 member countries and represents 98% of global trade. And its primary aim is to promote free trade, ensuring that trade flows as smoothly, predictably, and freely as possible. And that's really through reduced tariffs, reduced barriers to trade. So really free trade is the key mission of the WTO. And it achieves this by providing a forum for countries to negotiate trade agreements and settling disputes between members. So if countries are putting tariffs on each other and really disputing each other, and that threatens a growing trade war, it will settle those disputes. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The WTO operates on the principle of non-discrimination, meaning that member countries should not discriminate between their trading partners, which is the most favoured nation principle, and should not favour domestic goods over foreign goods, the national treatment principle. This aims to prevent protectionism, so that's tariffs, and promote fair competition. So there's fair global trade where every country is able to kind of compete effectively in a global market, because there are a few tariffs put on by countries to protect their own industries. So the most favoured nation principle means that no country can offer special advantages to one trading partner without giving it to another. And the national treatment principle means that once a foreign good has entered a country's market, it must be treated the same as domestically produced goods, ensuring a level playing field so that countries can really compete with each other in their exports. How does the WTO do this then? So first, as I mentioned, it facilitates trade negotiations. So it provides a multilateral platform where lots of countries can come together to negotiate trade agreements. And these often focus on reducing tariffs, quotas, and other barriers to trade. And that is with the intention of helping trade flow as freely as possible to promote economic growth and development. One of these was the barley package. which was signed in 2013, and it is focused on reducing red tape and simplifying customs procedures globally. It's designed to cut the time and costs associated with trade by reducing bureaucratic barriers, and it's estimated to reduce global trade costs by 14.3% on average, therefore helping small businesses and landlocked countries participate more effectively in international trade. Crucially, member states can also negotiate free trade agreements with each other, rather than with all WTO member states. For example, the CPTPP involved Japan, Australia, Canada, and the UK has recently joined. The UK-Australia Free Trade Agreement was signed after Brexit, and the African Continental Free Trade Area that we're going to look at in more detail when we look at the African Union aims to create the largest free trade area in the world, covering 54 African countries. If no trade deal is in place between countries, member states must trade under WTO rules and therefore aim to reduce tariffs and promote free trade as much as possible. The second key thing that WTO does is it settles disputes. So it has a dispute settlement body that provides a structured mechanism for resolving trade disputes between member countries. So when one country believes that another is violating WTO agreements or free trade agreements, it can bring the issue before the dispute settlement body. And this helps to avoid kind of just growing tensions and growing retaliatory tariffs that can escalate into trade wars, and of course reduce free trade if there are greater tariffs. And it just provides a platform to resolve disagreements effectively and neutrally. There's been successful examples of this. For example, the Brazil versus the United States, there was a case in relation to cotton subsidies, where Brazil argued the United States were providing illegal subsidies to its cotton farmers, violating WTO agreements and distorting global cotton prices, which harmed Brazilian farmers. And the dispute settlement body ultimately ruled in favour of Brazil in 2004 and confirmed that the US had violated international trade rules, and the US agreed to pay compensation as a result of $300 million and reform its agricultural policies. On the other hand, though, crucially, with this being more recent and being the most significant global trade issue, it's been really unsuccessful in resolving the US-China trade war. So under Trump's first administration in 2018, the United States imposed tariffs of $360 billion worth of Chinese goods, accusing China of unfair trade practices, including in relation to intellectual property theft and subsidies to state-owned enterprises. China then retaliated by imposing tariffs on US exports, including agricultural goods, in particular soybeans, which are really important, leading to a significant escalation in the trade conflict. However, it wasn't that it was brought to the WTO for dispute settlement and it was resolved. Instead, it just bypassed formal WTO dispute mechanisms. Both countries continued to engage in tariffs that led to a sharp decline in bilateral trade. And they actually resolved it bilaterally through the Phase 1 trade agreement in January 2020. But China failed to meet its purchasing targets, and you've seen since under the Biden administration, and it looks like going to continue and get worse under the Trump administration, and the trade war is continuing. They didn't even try to resolve it through the WTO, which shows the impotence and the failure of the WTO to resolve disputes, and it looks like the dispute hasn't been resolved. In 2020, China did take its grievances to the WTO, and the WTO ruled that the US tariffs violated international trade rules, but the US simply just rejected the ruling, arguing that it was ill-equipped to handle modern trade issues, the WTO was, and China's state-controlled economic practices. So there's been no meaningful resolution to the trade war that suggests that the WTO has really been ineffective in this really important case. Okay. We're going to have a look at now the debate about the WTO. So we've first got some arguments for the strengths and successes of the WTO. And that's firstly that it's been successful in promoting free trade and economic growth. So since its creation in 1995, it's played a significant role in facilitating multilateral trade agreements between countries, helping to open markets and boost global trade. So it's successfully promoted trade liberalisation across various sectors, and in the decades following its establishment, the volume of world trade has more than tripled from 5 trillion in 1995 to over 22 trillion in 2021. Linked to this has been a number of multilateral trade agreements, such as the most recent was the Bali Trade Facilitation Agreement, as we looked at. So these multilateral trade agreements that it's able to facilitate have been really important to promoting free trade globally. The second key argument is that it successfully resolves disputes and prevents trade wars. So, as you mentioned, its dispute settlement body has been successful in managing some trade conflicts, and it gives countries a mechanism to come together and resolve disputes rather than resorting to constantly retaliating against each other with higher and higher tariffs. And the final key argument is that the WTO isn't dominated by developed countries and supports developing countries. So it's not dominated by developed countries in the same way that the IMF and the World Bank are. It actually operates on a one country, one vote system, ensuring that it isn't dominated by developed Western countries, which provides a critical platform for developing countries to influence global trade policies. And one of the most significant examples of success of the WTO in supporting developing countries is the case of China. So since joining the WTO in 2001, China experienced a period of unprecedented economic growth by gaining the greater market access that the WTO allowed. It's become the world's leading exporter, the manufacturing hub of the world, including in sectors such as electronics, machinery, and textiles. And it led to a kind of an average growth rate of close to 10% every year, which is remarkable. And between 2001, when it joined the WTO, and 2020, China's GDP grew from approximately 1.3 trillion to 14.7 trillion. So the WTO, by promoting free trade and integrating developing countries into the world economy, has really led to a very effective economic growth for developing countries, including China. Further, it does provide technical assistance and capacity building programs to developing countries to help them better integrate into global trade. On the other hand, then, there are some arguments, though, for the weaknesses and failures of the WTO. First of all, it's actually had limited success in agreeing multilateral trade agreements, especially recently. So it may have secured the Bali development round, but that was relatively limited, and it's been really unsuccessful in its key thing it was looking to negotiate, which is the Doha development round, which was actually launched in 2001, and it aimed to reduce trade barriers and address inequalities between developed and developing states. But after years and years of negotiations, it's largely stalled due to disagreements between developing and developed states over agricultural subsidies, intellectual property, and market access. And this has really diminished the WTO's credibility as the platform for negotiating multilateral trade agreements. And there's been instead a greater use of bilateral and regional trade agreements, which really bypass the WTO, suggesting that it effectively doesn't play as important a role as it potentially could do. And it's struggling to maintain its relevance in an era where countries are simply bypassing it in favour of going directly to other countries. Another key argument, as we looked at with the US-China trade war, is that the WTO is often unable to address major global trade disputes, and its rulings are often rejected. So the dispute settlement body is one of the key mechanisms of the WTO, but its enforcement has been shown to be weak in recent years. So over 20% of trade disputes remain unresolved that have been brought to WTO in the last decade. And high-profile disputes such as the US trade war illustrate how countries have just bypassed the WTO's dispute resolution mechanism, and it's simply been ineffective in promoting free trade and resolving these big trade agreements. That's due to the erosion of trust in the WTO's ability to enforce rulings and really resolve disputes. And finally, a key argument is that trade negotiations continue to be dominated by wealthy nations. So it may operate on a one country, one vote principle, but in practice, wealthy states like the United States and European Union exert disproportionate influence over trade negotiations. And developing countries struggle to have their voices heard. So one of the big reasons why the Doha round failed was that developed countries were pushing for greater access to developing markets, which would have really harmed poorer nations' farmers. And the poorer nations rejected this, but this ultimately resulted in a failure of the Doha round. And this imbalance has led to the perception that WTO, as all international institutions are kind of criticised for, primarily serves the interests of the global north, despite its claims to support equitable development worldwide. Okay, so that was the WTO. What we're going to have a look at now is the G7 and the G20, which are officially known as the Group of 7 and the Group of 20. And these, in comparison to formal intergovernmental organisations like the WTO or the IMF or the World Bank, are more informal forums where the world's major economies come together to discuss and coordinate on global economic issues. So they don't have formal structures, but instead are simply informal forums where leaders come together for dialogue and cooperation. So, the Group of Seven, the G7, was established in the 1970s as a forum for the world's largest advanced economies to discuss global economic and political issues. So, it was originally the G6 when it was the US, the UK, France, Germany, Japan, and Italy. Canada then joined in 1976, and it did become the G8 for a time when Russia joined, but Russia was expelled following its annexation of Crimea in 2014, and it's been reverted back to the G7 since. The European Union, interestingly, also enjoys full membership rights, but doesn't host meetings, and therefore isn't really included in the G7. But of course, there are a number of key European Union countries in there anyway, in France, Germany, and Italy. So unlike the formal institutions, it lacks binding powers and doesn't have a permanent kind of secretariat. Instead, it's simply just annual meetings where leaders, annual summits where leaders of each country come together to discuss key global challenges. The presidency rotates annually among the member countries, and that country hosts it each year. So the summits are attended by leaders of the G7 countries, and then there are also additional meetings held throughout the year by ministers, such as finance ministers or foreign ministers, for also them to cooperate. And its real power and importance comes from the economic and political weight of its member countries, which collectively represent 50% of global GDP. And it doesn't enforce policies directly, but it can really shape both global governance. When you effectively put the 7 most powerful leaders in the world of advanced economies, they can really agree some really important decisions, even if they're not necessarily binding or in a formal sense as other organisations are. So then what does it do? So its original aim was to address the economic instability caused by the 1973 oil crisis and the global recession that followed. But over the time, it's just met regularly annually to address the key economic issues that face advanced economies. So it's played an important role in responding to financial crises, for example, during the 2008 financial crisis, and to kind of prevent further economic collapse during that crisis. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the growth of China as a strategic competitor to the United States in particular and advanced economies, the G7 is an increasingly important forum for discussing security concerns and coordinating and protecting the interests of the West. So it isn't completely limited to economic issues. We've got a couple of case studies where it had a significant impact. First of all, its response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So during the pandemic, the G7 demonstrated its importance as a global forum for crisis management by helping to coordinate economic and public health responses. So G7 members came together to address the health and economic impact of the pandemic, including pledges over 20 billion to support the development and distribution of vaccines, whilst G7 finance ministers also worked closely to provide economic support to nations struggling with the fallout from the pandemic, including suspending debt repayments for the world's poorest countries. It's also played a bit of a role in climate change initiatives. So at the 2021 summit, which was in Cornwall, it reaffirmed its commitment to the pledges under the Paris Agreement, and G7 nations collectively committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050 and pledged to cut emissions by nearly 50% by 2030. One of the outcomes was financial commitments to developing states to help them adjust to climate change of 100 billion annually. And the G7 also launched the Build Back Better World initiative, a response to China's Belt and Road initiative to invest in infrastructure in developing countries. So this really shows, these cases I think show that it may not be a formal structure, but when you put the 7 of the most powerful leaders in the world in a room, they can have a really important impact in managing global crises, also working strategically together to tackle other actors such as China, which are rising and challenging their power, and also coming together to tackle challenges such as climate change. So that's the G7. The G20 is very similar, but of course different in some ways as well. So it was established in 1999, later on, after the aftermath of the 1997 Asian financial crisis, as a forum for finance ministers and central bank governors from major economies to discuss global financial issues. So in comparison to the G7, which just has the most advanced Western economies, its purpose was to bring together both developed and emerging economies to improve global governance, and is expanded in 2008 to include heads of state due to the importance of responding to the 2008 global financial crisis. So it includes 19 countries plus the European Union, representing a mix of the world's largest, advanced and key emerging economies. So it includes the United States, China, India, the United Kingdom, Turkey, Canada, France, for example. So it's kind of 20 of the biggest economies in the world, but that of course doesn't just include the kind of Western really advanced economies, but also the ones who have really emerged in the last 20 years. So its members account for over 80% of global GDP, 75% of international trade, and 2/3 of the world's population. And that allows it to address a wide range of global challenges, giving it a more inclusive focus than simply the G7. As with the G7, it's an informal forum that simply has annual meetings rather than kind of being a formal structure. And it plays an important role, as a G7 does, in economic growth, financial stability, and its most prominent contribution has been coordinating global responses to the financial crisis. So it's really important, for example, in relation to the 2008 financial crisis. So it was a real turning point for the G20 that elevated its role in economic global governance. So the crisis began in the US housing market, but quickly spread globally, leading to a severe recession and financial instability. And at the Washington summit in November 2008, G20 leaders coordinated global response, pledging $5 trillion in stimulus packages. And this also led to the establishment of the Financial Stability Board, which strengthened global financial regulations to prevent future crises. So simply because there was an annual meeting and these were the most powerful leaders of the world, of the world's most powerful economies, it was really important in coordinating an effective response to that crisis. Since that 2008 financial crisis, it's also expanded its scope, as the G7 has, to tackle issues like climate change, inequality, and sustainable development. And it's also a place where a lot of important bilateral meetings between world leaders take place, because it's naturally bringing together the likes of China and the United States. Often they'll have bilateral meetings there. For example, at the G20 meeting in Bali, when Biden and Xi promised there would be no new Cold War. A final case study of the G20 is its focus on international tax reform. So the issue of tax avoidance by multinational corporations have been a long-standing concern for a lot of countries, particularly developing countries. And in 2021, G20 finance ministers came together to agree a landmark global minimum corporate tax rate of 15%, and they're now going to pressure other countries to do so. This aims to prevent multinational companies simply shifting to low tax jurisdictions and ensure that corporations pay a fair share of taxes where they operate. So this shows how one of the meetings between the finance ministers of the G20 can have a really important impact in making an economic decision that can impact the world and impact corporations, but also countries and the levels of tax they're able to levy. Final thing we're going to have a look at then is the debate about the G7 and G20. Firstly, some arguments that they're important and effective is that they promote economic stability and manage global crises. So both the G7 and G20, as we went through, have played a crucial role in coordinating responses to global crises. So the 2008, the G20 was particularly important, but also COVID-19, the G7 was particularly important. But their role also extends beyond economic crises. It also looks at global crises when these leaders are brought together. So for example, at the 2024 G7 summit, the group called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and increased humanitarian aid. They're a key forum for cooperation among key decision makers. They provide a really critical platform for cooperation between the world's most influential political and economic leaders, and they're the ones who have real decision-making power. That's where the strength and importance of the G7 and G20 come from, as they can make really important decisions. And the G20 can also be argued to have more inclusive cooperation than the G7, as it reflects both developed and emerging economies, and it isn't largely Western, really all Western advanced economies. On the other hand, there are some arguments that the G7 and G20 are unimportant and ineffective. That's firstly that their role is limited, as agreements are non-binding. So they may bring together important leaders, but because then is not kind of a formal organisations, they lack the authority to enforce binding decisions. So agreements are often made, but they're non-binding, and they're often then not followed through because there aren't enforceable commitments or measures to enforce compliance. They've also arguably been ineffective in resolving recent global crises. So despite this focus on being a key forum to resolve them, they've been ineffective in resolving the US-China trade war, a key global crisis. where there was a failure to mediate effectively by other countries, or a failure by the US and China to work together effectively to mediate and stop the crisis. Similarly, the G20 failed to coordinate a strong, unified response to the Russia-Ukraine war, demonstrating its limitations in crisis management as China and Russia oppose sanctions on Russia. And finally, a really important argument is that they exclude the vast majority of countries which are poorer. So even the G20 the G7 only includes 7 highly industrialized countries, whilst the G20 excludes over 80% of the world's countries, including many small and developing nations. And this lack of representation arguably undermines the legitimacy of the groups and means that the decisions naturally follow the interests of these nations, which are the world's wealthiest. So yeah, that was everything on the WTO, the G7 and the G20. And as I mentioned, in the 12 markers, you might compare the G7 with the G20. You might be asked to compare either of those or both of those with a different international institution, with the World Trade Organization or the WTO with a different organization. So it's really important to know them really well. And you can also really bring both of these into questions about economic global governance. You could get questions just about the WTO, though I think that's a bit less likely, but also they might be brought into questions on economic governance and poverty, for example. So really important to know this content well. Let me know in the comment section if you've got any comments or questions, and I'll get back to you, and I'll see you in the next video.